guys, it's Byron here and welcome to BSSE Productions. On this episode of the Fortnightly show, I'm going to be telling you about the film that we were going to make but was actually cancelled. It's not just any old film, it's actually part of the secret of the Slender Stones. So, I hope you enjoy. Okay, so when we started making this film that was cancelled, it was before the BSSE Productions YouTube channel was created. Way before that, and it was actually on my old YouTube channel that I had before this. But the secret of the Slender Stones part 2 had been done, and we knew it would be a while to do part 3. And it was about mid-October last year, and we wanted to get a film out for Halloween, which would be pretty cool because a lot of the films I do for BSSE Productions are obviously like horror related, so it would be perfect. And you may have noticed the secret of the Slender Stones part 3 is a lot longer than any of the other parts of the secret of the Slender Stones. Part 1's about 5 minutes long, part 2 is between like 7 and 8, but then part 3 is over half an hour. It's like 32 minutes long, and there's kind of a reason for that. Basically, we had lots of ideas of ways we could really make Jonathan, or the Slender Man, whichever way you want to look at it, a really strong character, which despite him being the main villain, you actually felt really sorry for that, and we wanted to give him kind of a bit of a backstory before the events of part 1, because in part 1 you just saw him as a human, but you knew he wasn't good. And basically, so we wanted to do a lot of things like that, but for a few reasons, like we went to film this movie and the audio was really bad, and that was one of the reasons we cancelled it, and it was really rushed for time, the filming of this film, because we got to the woods, which is about a 15-minute drive, and I left the SD card at home, so we couldn't record anything. And my mum, who drove us there, was so good. She drove all the way back for us, got the SD card and brought it out again. So we could film, but because it was so rushed and it was so windy, it was just really bad quality video, and we didn't really have any time to finish it, so it was just cancelled really. And these are just the scenes in the woods that we started to film. There were other scenes like just of me walking down the street that we never got around to filming. And yeah, a lot of the scenes though, in some ways, transitioned into a different form, but very similar to what we had planned for the secret of the Slender Stones part 0 in part 3. So we basically just moved a lot of the ideas we had in there over to part 3, and that is one of the reasons it is over half an hour long. But I actually have the script of the secret of the Slender Stones part 0 on my computer still, and I'm going to show you guys it and talk to you a bit about it, because it's so interesting to compare it to part 3, because if you like, this is kind of the original draft and part 3 is the finished product. But some of the things are actually quite different, so I think you'll find it very interesting, especially if you're a fan of the secret of the Slender Stones. So, I hope you enjoy. Okay then, if the film was actually made, it would have started by showing a clip from the secret of the Slender Stones part 2, where George and Kevis and India were talking about the pages they have found. And then I'd have another clip that we didn't get around to filming of Jonathan looking over them and then looking downwards rather sad. And then with scene 2, Jonathan is walking down the street, although as you can see it just says Slender as a human. And that's because at this point in the film's production we didn't even call him Jonathan. We wanted to give him an actual name other than just the Slender Man, but we didn't know what that was at this point. And then basically his phone rings, Kevis picks it up, and Jonathan's rather cross, and then they go on to say how Karis kind of didn't do anything when Jonathan was being bullied at school. So I guess this is kind of like what turned into the kind of betrayal of Karis and India to Jonathan in The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 3. So I guess that's where that idea kind of originated from. And then Karis tries to say it's not like that. And then it brings in Gary, who, in The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 3, is actually called Greg, but back here he was called Gary. And then basically, talk of the devil, after Jonathan hangs up, there's Gary. And then Gary kind of starts asking Jonathan about what just happened. And then, just like in the bit in The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 3, he kind of begins to beat him up. And it says there, he punches him in the stomach. And just like in Part 3, he like grabs his shirt and stuff. So you can see how a lot of this script kind of just went over to The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 3 eventually. And then the voice comes into it. And this is what came over to Part 3 in the part where Jonathan went to the forest after he'd stolen the stones and then had a dream when he fell asleep hearing the voice. Except the main difference in this is that he actually hadn't stolen the stones yet. But yeah, basically here he isn't dreaming, and this was basically to relate back to at the beginning of The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 1, where Jonathan had that monologue saying that the forest was his only friend. And this voice was initially supposed to be the forest, basically, or he thought it was the forest. Basically, all the kind of greed and temptations that he was being influenced by, because he was having a hard time, and this was a way around it, that he could get power. But in The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 3, I almost didn't include the whole thing with the voice, but then eventually I decided that it was needed, because it gave Jonathan the motivation to basically be the Slender Man, and he fully understood it. And basically, the whole thing about the voice being the forest doesn't shine through as much in The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 3. It's basically just the temptations in his head, although when Jonathan wakes up from the dream, you can kind of see that he's looking around asking where the voice is. So in his mind, you could say that he thinks this voice isn't just his mind, but it is the forest. So that links back to the monologue at the beginning, even though in Part 0 that it would have been done in a bit of a different way. And now where it says Scene 4, it's the next day, and Jonathan is just sat in the forest and sees the stranger walking past. And the stranger was in Part 3 too, but here it says Gisela, because Gisela's the person who played the stranger, both eventually in Part 3, and even though it wasn't released, she played it in Part 0. But here it pretty much happens the same way. Basically just Jonathan looks over, sees the stranger there, and isn't happy about it. But the difference is that there's a bit more dialogue with the voice, and then his phone rings, and this is kind of similar to Part 3 when Karis rang Jonathan, but here India rings Jonathan. It's not to be sympathetic, it's to have a go at him for basically Jonathan being fairly aggressive with Karis earlier on in the script of Part 0. But then basically they're like going back and forth with their point of views in this argument, and then India brings up the stone, and then after Jonathan's remembered what it is, because obviously there must have been some time where India told Jonathan about the stone. And that kind of happened in part 3 with the letter in the parcel that India left for Jonathan. But here, that part wasn't really included, so that was completely new in part 3. But basically, as soon as Jonathan remembers about the stone, he hangs up and knows that that is the key to the power, which you may have read that is something the voice said earlier, that Jonathan needed for all his troubles to be away. And then this is quite similar to the secret of how it happened in the Secret of the Slender Stones part 3. He basically goes to India's house and steals the stone. But then once again there's more dialogue with the voice, but I guess the main difference between part 0 and part 3 in all of this is that in part 0 Jonathan seemed much more crazy, whereas in a lot of ways in part 3 he did just seem like a normal guy having a hard time, and he just made bad decisions because of that. And now where Jonathan says, oh yes, so much power, so much of it, it's all mine, and that he needs to draw what he saw in that kind of a vision he had earlier after he took the stone and saw images of the Slender Man before his eyes. He decides that he needs to draw what he saw. So that kind of explains how some of the drawings of the Slender Man came on the pages, that he saw a vision of it when he grabbed the stone, and it really shows how powerful the stone was. And there's a kind of similar thing in part 3 where Jonathan's sat there at the bench and he's drawing a help me page, but there it's just words, and you can kind of assume that he drew the pictures of the Slender Man later after he knew what it was. And in part 3 he was kind of doing it for help, because it was the only way people could really listen to what he's saying and understand what he was saying. Here he just wanted to kind of draw what he saw because he was so crazy, and in a way he was kind of obsessed over the idea of the power that the Slender Stones and the Slender Man would give him. But then basically there's more dialogue with the voice, but then the stranger or Gisela comes back into it. And here, the big difference between her and part 3 is that the stranger is actually trying to fight back with Jonathan instead of just falling over and not saying anything. So that's pretty cool. And even the stranger says it herself, you're crazy. But then basically Gisela runs off, whereas in part 3 you never saw what happened because it went to a blackout, but you have an idea that it wasn't good. And then pretty much the film's over. So I hope you found this interesting. And that is The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 0 script. So I hope you found this episode of the Fortnightly Show interesting. But I've really just shown you the script of The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 0. And I also have some videos of that day we went out filming it still saved on my computer. So on a future episode of the Fortnightly Show, I'm going to be showing you some of those clips. So this is really only part 1 of looking at The Secret of the Slender Stones Part 0. Part 2 of it will be coming soon. So it won't be the next episode because I have something else planned for the next episode in 2 weeks. But it'll probably be the one after that, most likely. And what I have planned for the next episode is, because on the 7th of October, it's actually my birthday, and I'm hopefully getting something pretty cool that's filmmaking related. So I'm not going to show you what it is to keep it as a surprise, but that's what the next episode of the Fortnightly show will probably be. But there'll be part 2 of this cancelled BSSE production, the Fortnightly show, after that. But I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!